What's up everyone, today we will be reviewing the recently released tennis game Matchpoint for the Xbox Series X, Switch, and PlayStation. But first we will be taking a deeper dive into the state of tennis video games, something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I love tennis video games, and they have such an interesting, albeit flawed history in the gaming landscape. If you just want to see my review of Matchpoint, jump to the timestamp here and listed in the video description. Let's get started.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this casual match.
In order to truly understand the state of tennis video games today, it's important to see how they've progressed over the years. In my opinion, tennis games can be distinctly divided into three eras of gaming. The retro era, which spans from games like Pong and NES Tennis all the way through the end of the 2D tennis games in the late 90s. The Big Three era is next, which spans the most competitive era of tennis video games, where three major franchises push the limits on the sport. The Virtua Tennis series from Sega, the Topspin series from 2K, and the Grand Slam Tennis series from EA. I personally consider this the peak era for tennis in video games, which we'll talk about later. And after that, the current, modern era, which is essentially when big studio developers stopped making tennis games and they've become an indie studio experience. This era of gaming is where we stand today, and where Matchpoint comes onto court here in 2022. Again, if you're looking for a review of Matchpoint specifically, skip ahead towards the end of the video. When looking back through the years, it's kind of absurd how many tennis games there actually were. From the late 80s through the 90s, there were several dozen different tennis games released across everything from PCs to the original PS1 to Atari to the Sega Genesis. I could do several videos on all of these alone, but I'll highlight just a few here. Honestly, I could even go all the way back to the original Pong, or even further back to this weird 2D tennis game from 1958 called Tennis for Two, which some folks regard as the literal first video game ever made. But I digress, and we'll jump forward a little bit here to the aptly named Tennis in 1981 for the Atari 2600 and NES Tennis in 1984. Visually, these are really the first games where something resembling a tennis match actually looked as such on screen instead of just glorified Pong. These were quickly followed up in the next generation by other 2D tennis games like Jimmy Connor's Pro Tennis Tour in 1990, Super Tennis in 1991, and David Crane's Amazing Tennis in 1992. Eventually, we started shifting away from 2D tennis and into the 3D experience. This was certainly a mixed bag for a while, often resulting in games that visually tried to look as realistic as possible, but often at the sacrifice of the actual gameplay. By my count, there were over 30 tennis games alone released in the 90s, which is crazy compared to today's slow trickle of tennis games. At the same time, this was also the infancy of tennis licensing, so a lot of games tried to capitalize on the popularity of the sport, with other titles being released such as Pete Sampras Tennis, Andre Agassi Tennis, or Anna Kournikova's Smash Court Tennis, just to name a few. This rush of tennis experiences in the 90s did eventually die down with the release of Virtua Tennis from Sega in 1999, bringing on the next era in tennis video games. These 2 decades of really random tennis games from tons of different developers eventually led us to what I'm calling the Big Three era of tennis gaming. This began with the launch of 2 of the most popular tennis gaming franchises of all time, Virtua Tennis from Sega and Topspin from 2K. From 1999 to 2012, we saw a total of 11 different games from these 2 franchises alone, each of them incrementally improving upon the last installments. Combined, they essentially became the Madden of tennis video games. This competition was extremely healthy for the sport, which also combined with significant visual advances in gaming technology, eventually culminated in Top Spin 4, which I still think is the best tennis game to date, despite releasing almost 12 years ago. The third franchise that I'm throwing into the mix here is the short-lived but decently well-made Grand Slam Tennis series from EA, of which there are just a total of 2 games, but the only tennis games to date that have the official license from Wimbledon. Because of that licensing alone, you could argue that the Grand Slam Tennis games look the best in terms of presentation and overall aesthetics. In terms of gameplay, the Virtua Tennis series skewed a bit more arcadey, and the Top Spin series was a bit more of a serious simulation, and Grand Slam Tennis landing somewhere in the middle of both.
Bruce Lieberman has wisely chosen a tennis racket over nunchucks to serve.
So what made Top Spin 4 such a great tennis experience? There's a lot of factors, but honestly it boils down to the gameplay itself and how it provides a smooth and realistic representation of the sport. The problem with many tennis games, even modern ones, is there are often severe flaws or balancing issues in the gameplay that can be exploited. That is really not the case with Top Spin 4. Everything from how the players respond at the net, to baseline rallies, to serving and returning, were all finely tuned to be a nice skill-based experience that is very rewarding to anyone who takes the time to master the controls. Quick side note here that the Mario Tennis franchise spans all 3 of these eras, which some of the games are actually quite good, but mostly due to the over-the-top arcade nature of them, they're a bit different than the point of this video. Although games like Mario Power Tennis for the GameCube can be played with characters' abilities turned off in classic or simple mode, resulting in a pretty decent representation of the sport. I've played 5-set marathons with my friends in these games, and at times these feel like a legit tennis simulation, even if they don't really look the part. And don't worry, I didn't forget about Wii Tennis or Switch Tennis, but these are not really full-fledged experiences, so even though they are fun, they don't really scratch the itch of the more serious tennis sport fan. So why did big studio developers stop making tennis video games? Well, it should be obvious, but in short, money. The cost to license and develop these games simply wasn't and still really isn't worth it. It's sad, but that has led us to the quote, modern era of tennis games that we see today. Tennis is a tricky sport to license, with having to acquire a number of copyrights, trademarks, and other licenses, many of which are even international. That's a tough ask for a small development team. For example, you just can't have the rights to MLB or the NFL and their respective players association and call it a day. In tennis, you need to acquire the rights to a ton of different things to make it feel authentic, starting with the men's and women's tour and trademarks, the ATP and the WTA. You also need the rights to individual stadium venues and the tournaments themselves, which is why we've only seen Wimbledon licensed once ever in a tennis game. And games like Matchpoint don't even have official recreations of real-life tournaments. And finally, you need the rights to each individual player in the game, logos, and more. All of this is an absolute headache for a small development team and for a sport that doesn't have the widespread appeal of other name-brand franchises like FIFA, Madden, or NBA 2K.
Yes, keeping your head, it's the key.
With all that being said, we've only had 2 somewhat legitimate attempts at making a new tennis game franchise in the last decade. The AO Tennis series from Big Ant Studios and Tennis World Tour, also from Big Ant Studios. Wait, 2 franchises released from the same developer? Well, kind of. The original Tennis World Tour was released in 2018 alongside AO Tennis from Big Ben Interactive and developer Breakpoint, but was an absolute unmitigated disaster. It was a complete mess of an experience and frankly the worst tennis game I have ever played, especially when starved for a tennis game for almost half a decade after Topspin 4. This became apparent when the company admitted the game was only 20% finished a couple weeks before release, but they released it anyway, due to a marketing campaign at the time with the French Open. They even made retailers sign no return contracts so they would essentially scam them on the purchase. The game was a clunky and buggy mess, missing a ton of features online at launch and really a ton of features just in general. This led to the publisher to switching developers to Big Ant Studios for the sequel, which was a last-ditch and lame effort to save this terrible franchise and recoup any losses, despite the obvious conflict of interest with AO Tennis 2 also releasing in 2020 at the exact same time. With the complete mess of all of that above, AO Tennis 2 did in particular do a lot of things well. My favorite aspect of the game is the fact you can create and share custom players and venues, meaning any player not in the game officially has basically been created by the online community, resulting in by far the largest roster of pros in any tennis game ever, and decent representations of any lower level ATP or WTA tournaments. Conceptually, this is such an underrated feature and gets past the licensing hurdles mentioned earlier that many other games face across really all sports. Now, if a big name developer tried doing this, there would be a ton of pushback, but since tennis games exist a bit off the grid, it's really cool to see this here.
30 all.
Now it'll get tricky. This is match point for him.
And that finally brings us to Matchpoint, the most recent tennis simulation game to grace the gaming arena. Developed by Torus Games and published by Calypso, Matchpoint is the latest attempt at a modern tennis game. I will say upfront that Matchpoint is the best playing tennis game since Topspin 4 released back in 2011. That's not to say it's without its flaws, but compared to AO Tennis and the World Tour tennis games, it takes a handful of steps in the right direction. It manages, for the most part, to get the actual tennis gameplay correct, and if there is something that those games have taught us, it's that if the actual tennis gameplay is bad, literally nothing else matters. Matchpoint is actually a decently smooth experience on the court. It borrows the simultaneous control style introduced by AO Tennis, where shots and movement are controlled by the same control stick, but does so in a way that is much more fluid. The resulting back and forth gameplay feels tight, responsive, and not glitchy whatsoever. Even play at the net is acceptable and not game-breaking like it can be in other modern franchises. Unfortunately, the gameplay is a bit overshadowed by an extremely dull on-court presentation and repetitive announcers who actually say it's match point when it isn't. It happens whenever the set is tied at 5, which is kind of embarrassing for a game literally called Match Point. I can look past all of this though because the game is legitimately fun to play as a tennis fan. Unfortunately, outside of the court, Matchpoint is a shallow experience. There's an alright career mode that allows you to slowly build your created player over the course of a tennis calendar season. No tour or venue licenses here, so you'll be playing matches at fake versions of Wimbledon and the US Open. That's honestly not a big deal, since they still pretty much feel like what they're supposed to, and there's no confusion about what they're trying to represent. When you're not playing in these tournaments, you can take part in small practice sessions with your coach of choice, or unlock new equipment for some slight performance boosts. Outside of this career mode, there's a quick match mode, both online and offline, and that's pretty much it. Online, your ranking will go up and down as an ELO number, gaining points if you win, losing points if you don't. Unfortunately, there's no career mode or stat tracking, so this number is kind of meaningless without anything to compare it to, and no leaderboard or win-loss tracker means no incentive to really keep playing. Even AO Tennis had a leaderboard feature with better stat tracking. I wish I could combine the ideas and infrastructure of AO Tennis with the gameplay of Matchpoint, and together that could in theory be a good, maybe even great tennis game. However, because of how shallow Matchpoint is in terms of things to do, with almost no customization tools or the ability to share online with others, makes it a missed opportunity in a lot of ways. That aspect is disappointing because again, the gameplay itself feels good, if not great at times, in simulating a professional tennis match. There are way less exploitive gameplay tactics, and trying to figure out your opponent's strengths and weaknesses is honestly the best I've seen outside of the Topspin or Mario Tennis franchises. The result is certainly a mixed bag, but a fun game for tennis purists who are dying for a new and modern tennis experience.
It's so important for this match. That's the break.
So where does this leave tennis video game fans? Well, the Tennis World Tour franchise is probably dead forever, and that's a good thing. And the AO Tennis series, while a valiant effort, could easily be as well if it didn't sell that many copies. I think we are left with the following: a bigger budget sequel to Matchpoint that takes the decent gameplay foundation but gives fans more things to do would be great, and I'd be accepting to that with open arms. Or a hope that a resurrection of the Topspin franchise will return at some point. The latest round of rumors regarding the Topspin franchise suggests that something could finally be in the works from 2K. Regardless, the tennis gaming community deserves something to look forward to, and I can only hope that someone somewhere will take the lessons learned over the last decade and create the tennis game that we've all been waiting for. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.
15-30.